Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. This video is part of a series I'm doing on Dante's Divine Comedy, wherein I'm reading through the entire Divine Comedy, all three books, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, at a rate of 3 cantos or chapters per week. I'm doing this as an independent contribution to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante Project. If you haven't heard of the 100 Days of Dante Project, please click through on the link I provide down in the show notes. It's a fantastic resource. They provide scholarly talks about each canto, and they do it in much the same fashion as I do at a rate of 3 cantos per week. I really think you'll like it, so check it out. If this is your first time visiting me, first of all, thank you for visiting the channel, and I would invite you to please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I've set the goal of getting to 200 subscribers by the end of October. I think the current count right now, at the time of recording, is 183, so we're almost there, and with your help, I'm sure we can get there. So thanks in advance for that. Quick note about the organization of these videos. There's a bunch of different parts. You have this introduction, which will be followed by a synopsis, where I'll cover the main action and the main plot of the canto under discussion. Then I'll move along to a characters and themes section, where I will cover, you guessed it, the characters and the themes. I'll follow that up with the takeaway section, which is where I will offer my own personal thoughts on the canto and how we can use it to try to live a better life ourselves. And then I'll wrap things up with an outro, and we'll go wherever the YouTube algorithm takes us. All right, so with that, we're going to jump right into it then. Welcome to Dante's Inferno, Canto 20. Today's synopsis is going to be very short because, frankly, not that much happens in this canto, at least in terms of action. First, we're given this odd introduction by Dante, with him telling us that we're now entering the 20th canto. I guess he's concerned about the people in the back of the room who might not be paying attention. And then after this, Dante the Pilgrim sets his eyes for the first time upon the sinners in this canto, and these are the diviners. And what's going on with these people is they're collected down in the fourth ditch, and they're roaming around in circles endlessly, circling about forever, issuing silent weeping like a sad litany procession. Dante the poet then quickly interrupts the poem, and he asks readers to contemplate how difficult it must be for him not to have broken down in tears upon seeing this. Then, back to the action. Dante gets a better look at the sinners that are collected down in this fourth ditch, the diviners. And what he sees is truly one of the better instances of body horror in this entire poem. And by better, of course, I mean more grotesque. Because what has happened is that the heads of these sinners, though they're walking forward, they're actually looking backwards because someone has snapped their neck and just mangled their body to the point where their face is now facing behind them. And not only that, as they walk, they're just continuously weeping. And so you have, from the eyes of all these sinners, just this continuous stream of tears flowing down their backsides and eventually nestling in between the cracks of their buttocks. So, bright side thinking, sinners. Natural bidet. At this point, Dante himself starts to cry, and Virgil is having none of it. He reprimands Dante for crying, basically saying, "Are you still so witless as all the rest? There's no room for pity here. Because the divine justice being administered is that. It's just. These people are getting what they deserve." And after that, there's really not much more to report, because all that happens is that Virgil explains to Dante who all these sinners are, or at least, particular instances of them. And once again, we have examples from the classical world and examples from the contemporaneous world. The contemporaneous world to Dante, not to us, of course. There is this one odd thing, though. At 2 points in the poem, Virgil interrupts his description of these sinners to offer his own thoughts on his hometown of Mantua, not only how it's doing nowadays, but also how it was founded. And we're going to talk more about this later in the characters and themes section, which by coincidence is actually going to be right now. In today's characters and themes section, I'd first like to take a little bit of time to talk about the theology behind divination and why the Christian tradition in general and the Roman Catholics in particular find it to be so problematic and sinful. And then after that, we'll also consider the great contrapasso of this canto, and we'll follow that up with a little bit of talk of Dante the Pilgrim's character development, and then we'll close things out by discussing that strange Virgil digression into the origin of his native city of Mantua. I think it's important to first discuss divination because on the surface it might not seem to be so objectionable. Although once you come to understand the Roman Catholic position on the sin, you start to understand why exactly it is truly objectionable. And so the Catholic Church holds that all forms of divination are to be rejected. And they're talking here about recourse to Satan, the conjuring up of the dead, recourse to demons as well, and other false practices that unveil the future. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states that consulting horoscopes, astrology, palm reading, interpretation of omens and lots, the phenomena of clairvoyance, and recourse to mediums all conceal a desire for power over time, history, and, in the last analysis, other human beings, as well as a wish to conciliate hidden powers. They contradict the honor, respect, and loving fear that we owe to God alone. So the power over all of time, the future included, belongs to God alone. So the Christian attitude towards fate is that one must place one's faith in providence, not in fortune tellers. So now that we've covered that and we understand why divination is considered to be such a grave sin, we can now look at the contrapasso of the canto. And in reality, this is really one of the more obvious contrapassos in the entire poem. Because what's going on here is that the diviners are being punished. And the diviners, of course, are fortune tellers. They held the power to themselves of looking into the future. And the way that they're punished for this is their heads are snapped backwards, so they can't see forward, they can only see backwards. This is the contrapasso. And in addition to that, they really can't see anything, not even backwards, because remember, they're crying constantly. Their eyes are filled with obscuring tears, so they're unable to see in any direction. Now let's talk about Dante. Some of you may recall my theory that back in Canto 17, Dante had this great revelation where he came to accept the true Christian faith on his ride down to Mount Bolge on the back of Geryon, and how this can be said to be a turning point in terms of his character in the poem where he changes. Well, here we have him crying once again. So on the surface, it looks like maybe he didn't really change at all. In fact, this is kind of what Virgil argues when he reprimands Dante for crying. For Virgil, Dante appears to still be filled with pity for these sinners. And as a committed Christian, Dante should not be feeling this way. On the contrary, he should be fully invested in the idea that God is good and that all the punishments that he sees being administered are divinely appointed and appropriate and just. That's a decent point. I can see what he's talking about, but I think he's wrong here. It's not at all clear to me that what Dante is crying over is the pity he feels for the sinners and their predicament. Look closer at what Dante actually says. When I saw, up close, our human likeness, so contorted that tears from their eyes ran down their buttocks, down into the cleft. This is a very empathetic statement. Dante's sorrow is born of empathy. He refers to our human likeness. He sees in these sinners not just their suffering, but the potential for such blindness in all people, himself included. So I don't think that he's so upset over these sinners necessarily. It could just be that he sees in them all living in future humanity who could fall into the same sins that they fell into. And now we come to the controversial stanzas concerning Virgil's digressions into his hometown of Mantua. And what we're going to be concerned about most here are the lines that deal with the origin of Mantua. The response to these lines are indeed very controversial. My knowledge is limited to the English language commentaries on the poem, and even in just the English language commentaries, you're going to see a lot of varied takes on what is going on in these lines. The controversy is this. In the Aeneid, Virgil describes the foundation of the city of Mantua as being founded by Ocnus, the son of Manto. In today's canto, however, Virgil, in introducing the character of Manto, who's being punished down in the fourth ditch of Mount Bolge for the sin of divination, Virgil says that it's actually she who founded the city of Mantua. Because what happened is, once she died, on her instructions, people built the city on top of her bones. And there's no mention whatsoever of Ocnus in this telling of it. In fact, Manto is referred to as a virgin in this canto, so there's no possible way she could even have reproduced. So Ocnus is truly nothing. Then, to top things off, Virgil tells Dante that if Dante is ever to hear of an alternative telling of the founding of Mantua, like the alternative telling that Virgil himself produced back in the Aeneid, that Dante is to correct this lie. He's not to allow the lie to spread. And if that's not enough confusion over Manto, once we get up to Purgatorio, we're going to read that Manto is back in limbo. But how could that be when she's suffering in the fourth ditch of Mabolge? It turns out that even Dante needs an editor. And in addition to all this confusion over the character of Manto, you'll also find in the critical analysis of this canto that Virgil's telling of the foundation of Mantua is often described as a digression. That is, it's not related to the main thesis or the subject. But I disagree. I actually see this digression as central to the argument that's being made here. Remember that the problem with divination, at least according to the Catholic Church, is that it replaces God with mankind as masters of temporal knowledge. Divination is what occurs when mankind assumes the power to know the future, but the future is only one direction of time. So we can think of history as mankind's divination of the past. We often think that we can say with certainty what the past means and what it says about the present, but perhaps this is a violation of the first commandment too. Look at the Catechism's definition once again. Consulting horoscopes, astrology, palm reading, interpretation of omens and lots, the phenomena of clairvoyance, and recourse to mediums all conceal a desire for power over time, history, and, in the last analysis, other human beings, as well as a wish to conciliate hidden powers. They contradict the honor, respect, and loving fear that we owe to God alone. So perhaps what Dante the poet is saying to us here is that by having Virgil digress into Mantua's past, is that even the historical record, which we tend to think of as set and certain, is open to interpretation and not so clear as we'd like it to be. That is, there is no foundational truth discernible to feeble human intelligence that can be divined by historical analysis, precisely because, as Virgil shows today, the past is fundamentally confused and opaque. The truth of the past is much more complicated and obscure than any one narrative we tell ourselves about it. Therefore, any attempt to draw conclusions about present circumstances by divination into the past is inherently flawed and problematic. Divination into the past is just as sinful as divination into the future. This isn't to say that history is not a worthy discipline. It is. Nor is it to say that thinking about the future and planning for the future is wrong. It's not. It's just to say, I believe, that all ultimate temporal knowledge is held by God alone, so it's foolish to divine into the future or into the past. After all, the sinners today, even though they are facing backwards into the past, their vision remains obscured. All right, so I know I've said this before, and I'm probably going to say it again in the future, in addition to today. But I just want to say that this poem, Canto 20, has one of the best lines, in my opinion, in the entire poem. And again, I've said that before, but obviously there's a reason for this. There's a reason we've been reading this poem for 700 years. That's because it's a classic. It's filled to the brim with classic lines. But this line in particular is close to my heart because of my interest in Stoicism and its Stoic character. I'm talking about Virgil's reprimanding of Dante for crying. Virgil says, "Here piety lives when pity is quite dead. Who is more impious than one who thinks that God shows passion in his judgment?" I read this line as substituting in mankind's understanding for God's understanding, or nature's understanding if you're a secular humanist, whatever. The point is, at least as I read it, is that Virgil is saying that there's a higher intelligence at work here, beyond all human understanding, and therefore it's folly to get upset over what you do not and indeed cannot understand. Virgil is saying that God has no passionate judgment. Passions are the whims and vagaries of humanity. And actually, the whims and vagaries of humanity are precisely what make it impossible for mankind to understand ultimate truth or ultimate wisdom. Essentially, we have a dinner table's understanding of dinner. The Christian response to life, then, as we saw back in the Catechism's discourse on divination, is simply to put oneself completely and confidently into the hands of providence. We see this very same sentiment repeated throughout the Stoic writings, only of course they're not talking about providence as the one monotheistic God. They're talking about it more as nature, as they refer to it. But the same thing applies though. The only wisdom to be had among unknowing, ignorant creatures such as ourselves is acceptance of things as they are. Now this is a very tough lesson. The human mind rebels against it, and rebels against it quite hard. It feels wrong when there is an injustice. It feels wrong when there's a sadness or an outrage. But these, again, are human feelings we're mapping onto natural phenomena. They're simply not applicable. This isn't to say, of course, as social creatures we aren't called to build a better world, because of course we are. But it is to say that in the end, many things are simply beyond our control, and even more so, beyond our understanding. So, when life gets you down and feeling sad or upset, just recall, as I do, the words of Virgil, or good old Joseph de Maistre, who in his St. Petersburg dialogue writes, "Here is our master and our model. One must never begin in these sorts of questions with a contentious pride that is a crime because it argues against God, which leads straight to blindness. Before all else, one must cry out, 'How good you are!' and assume that there is in our mind some error, that it is simply a question of unraveling." Alright, that's my video for Canto 20 of Dante's Inferno. I hope you liked it. If you did like it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. We've set the goal of getting to 200 subscribers by the end of October. At the time of this recording, we're at 183 subscribers, I believe, so it's totally achievable to get up to 200 by the end of the month. And we can do it with your help, so thanks in advance for that. But more importantly than getting likes for this video or subscriptions to the channel is getting a conversation going about this poem. So why don't you let me know what you think about the poem, or this canto in particular, down in the comments below. I'm really eager to hear what you have to say. Thanks a lot for that. And if you want to contact me in another fashion, you can do so on Twitter at Brian E. Denton. These videos are going to be released every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And so the next video is going to be released on Monday. Until then, take care of yourselves and others. In the Aeneid, in the Aeneid, in the Aeneid, Aeneid, in the 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 Aeneid, Virgil, here we go. In the Aeneid, in the Aeneid, in the Aeneid, Virgil, in the Aeneid, Virgil, just, come on, man. In the Aeneid, Virgil,